We are living in a time when the age of illusions is over. European nations are at a decisive moment in their history, facing a world undergoing profound change as well as both internal and external challenges. The era when they could calmly rely on American protection and the benefits of the Pax Americana is over, and a new international order is emerging, marked by complex and sometimes conflicting multipolarity. The global rise of China, the development of the Russian military-industrial complex, and the unpredictable shifts in American policy are forcing European countries to undertake a complete reassessment of their strategic direction, an exercise not conducted since the Berlin Wall fell. It will be essential to define coherent objectives supported by a clear long-term strategy, because words alone are not enough. Actions will also have to be assessed. Within this new reality, NATO, as a transatlantic military alliance, remains for now the only structure that brings together a minimally coherent European defense. The crucial question then arises, will we have to settle for excessive dependence on the United States? Will European nations as a political entity choose to control their own destiny, fully embrace their sovereignty, and gain the means to prosper and defend themselves? The issue goes far beyond the field of defense, because this rearmament cannot be complete in the world to come without a robust economy, an efficient industry, and a dynamic population. You are on Terabellum, and today we are going to talk about the uncertain future of transatlantic cooperation and Europe facing the test of reality. We live in a world where our data circulates as freely as ideas, and it has become essential to protect our digital lives. That's exactly what NordVPN offers, which goes far beyond simply changing your virtual location or unlocking access to geo-restricted content anywhere in the world. Thanks to its threat protection, you get active defense against malware, trackers, and malicious websites, even when the VPN is turned off. Continuous security designed for those who work, stay informed, and explore online every day. The NordVPN Plus subscription also includes NordPass, an advanced password manager. It generates complex passwords and stores them securely, and notifies you if your data appears in a leak, a valuable tool at a time when cyber threats are increasing. Add to that end-to-end encryption, a strict no-logs policy, unlike other free VPNs, and the ability to connect on 10 devices simultaneously with a kill switch feature, which will cut off all internet access if your VPN coverage is compromised. Right now, use the link in the description to get 4 free months on a 2-year subscription, costing about €3 per month plus a 30-day money-back guarantee. Since its creation in 1949, NATO has played a central role in ensuring security in Europe, relying on transatlantic cooperation and the American commitment symbolized by Article 5, which guarantees collective defense among its members. This foundation has made it possible to maintain stability on the continent for several decades, with the exception of the wars in the Balkans and the war in Ukraine. However, this dependence on the United States is now revealing its limits, especially in light of diverging priorities among the members, and above all, the strategic shift of the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump. A growing part of American public opinion is questioning the U.S. military presence in Europe, and Trump was elected by promising to review this commitment, which has profoundly reshaped transatlantic cooperation. See the video, he's back. NATO as a structure is being put to the test. The American president criticized the alliance, denouncing the free riders represented by certain European countries that were not dedicating enough resources to their defense. He threatened to reduce American involvement, or even to leave NATO if the Europeans did not meet their budgetary obligations, thus forcing European countries to increase their military spending. This pressure is accompanied by an American desire to maintain strategic control, especially on trade issues in Europe, while pushing Europeans to take more responsibility for their own security. See the video, The Big Deal. This dynamic has resonated with some European leaders, such as Emmanuel Macron, who has called for raising the European defense budget to 3 or 3.5% of GDP, exceeding the minimum threshold of 2% required by NATO. Eastern European and Scandinavian countries geographically opposed to Russia have been the most proactive in increasing their military spending, while countries like Germany and France promise efforts, but with different priorities. For example, France aims for strategic autonomy with its 2024-2030 military programming law, while Germany prioritizes collective defense in its Zentweiter, which already illustrates the main internal differences within the alliance. Collective defense favored by Germany is NATO, as we have known it since 1949, with a mutual commitment to protection within NATO, whereas strategic autonomy is a military, but also political ambition, which aims to guarantee an actor, here, France, but also, in theory, the European Union, the ability to act independently and as a sovereign power outside of the Anglo-Saxon sphere. The problem, as you can see, is always the same. Germany, being more conservative, prefers to improve an already existing solution and to stick to it. France, being more idealistic or ambitious, favors a new solution that goes much further, going beyond the military framework, which is not to everyone's liking in a post-Cold War order. Europe is not a homogeneous bloc. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe consider NATO to be an indispensable bulwark for their defense against Russia. Poland, for example, plans to increase its army to 500,000 troops and act in tandem with the United States. Meanwhile, the Baltic states, with their limited resources, rely on the solidarity of the alliance. The United Kingdom, despite Brexit, also remains a key player in European geopolitics, especially through its involvement in the Ukrainian crisis and its defense agreements with several European countries. Southern European countries in turn prioritize Mediterranean region stability. France, with its nuclear deterrent force, is actually the only European power capable of defending itself and a potential autonomous European bloc, which is why it promotes strategic autonomy. Germany, for its part, despite a recent increase in its military spending, remains focused on economic, energy, and industrial priorities, which limits its direct military involvement. See, here is the video. Germany is on the verge of collapse. The only point of convergence that exists for now is that European states recognize the need to strengthen their defense and take greater responsibility on the continent, which is exactly what Donald Trump's United States is seeking to achieve. The problem for France is that it is directly confronting the great Anglo-Saxon geopolitics, and they have no interest in seeing one or more continental powers emerge that could directly challenge American thalassocracy as a whole. In other words, military and especially economic, whether Russian, German, or French, and this has been the case in Europe for over 200 years. That is why the credibility of the European rearmament policy will depend on the coherence of its objectives, ranging from the ability to strengthen military resources to the competitiveness of the defense industry, and on political coordination to define a clear and shared strategy, even on the issue of European demographics, because we will need workers to build these weapons and soldiers to use them. The European Commission has proposed the Rearm Europe plan, an ambitious initiative aimed at mobilizing 800 billion euros over 4 years. This plan combines loans to member states and a relaxation of budgetary rules. However, its implementation faces 4 major obstacles. First of all, there are national budgetary constraints. France, Italy, and Spain are facing high levels of public debt. These constraints limit the room for maneuver to increase military budgets without compromising other essential public expenditures such as education, health, infrastructure, and so on. Italy, for example, has had to deal with social tensions related to managing its debt and the pressure on social services, which makes any increase in defense spending politically sensitive. The same goes for France, where the defense budget for 2025 is already up by 3.3 billion euros compared to 2024. And if France reaches its goal of 3.5% of its GDP for defense, that would mean almost doubling the current budget for a total of 91 billion euros. In summary, ambition is confronted by economic reality, which limits room for maneuver. Moreover, it's important to remember that simply increasing the budget is not enough on its own. If investments are not well targeted and if political and industrial coordination is not strengthened by clear and coherent objectives and strategy, the results risk being disappointing. The second obstacle is political and social opposition. The increase in military budgets is sparking intense debates, especially in Germany. Part of public opinion remains reluctant about this rearmament, fearing that these expenditures will come at the expense of social services and an already struggling industry, all coupled with the energy crisis and the risk of rising inflation. The third obstacle is strategic differences. Defense priorities vary greatly. Eastern European and Nordic countries are geographically focused on Russia, while countries like Spain or Italy remain more cautious and are concerned about the Mediterranean region. This complicates the definition of a unified European strategy. France, moreover, straddles its continental ambitions and its maritime domains. It tries to position itself in the middle, but may therefore have a hard time truly convincing European powers from Poland to Italy, who ultimately rely more on the United States and collective defense than on strategic autonomy. And the fourth obstacle is simply institutional complexity and coordination. The multiplicity of structures, both EU and bilateral initiatives, etc., creates risks of duplication and inefficiency. Paradoxically, the Rearm Europe plan will probably take shape through better coordination with NATO to avoid redundancies, rather than through a new, strictly European structure. I would like to remind you that, in the context of economic warfare, the United States will seek to improve their trade balance in Europe by selling energy and weapons. 64% of European arms imports already came from the United States between 2020 and 2024. For reference, see the video, How Trump Will Make Europe Pay. Europe suffers from significant capability gaps that limit its ability to act independently, at least in the short or medium term. First of all, in terms of intelligence and surveillance, NATO relies heavily on American capabilities, especially satellite reconnaissance and AWACS systems, since Europe does not yet have an integrated system of this scale. Only France is doing relatively well with its CSO satellites launched since 2018, but those AWACS are American. Finally, when it comes to force projection, Europe lacks sufficient capability to rapidly deploy significant forces outside its borders. Strategic transport capabilities are still limited, and only France has been able to maintain this capability and preserve this expertise within the limits of its own resources, which are therefore insufficient for the entire bloc. Finally, nuclear deterrence, where only France has an independent nuclear deterrent force in Europe. This puts it in a position of strength, of course, but it also encourages a certain mistrust from the other European powers, who may prefer a deterrence guarantor across the Atlantic rather than a dominant power directly on the continent. This brings us back to classic Anglo-Saxon geopolitics, and finally is simply that the defense industry is fragmented. The European defense industry is largely fragmented across the territory, which leads to high costs, duplication, and a lower capacity for innovation. Strengthening the European defense industry is essential to reduce dependence on foreign suppliers and ensure technological sovereignty. This involves consolidating industrial players, investing in research and innovation, securing supply chains, and developing sovereign production capacities. As you can see, the future of European security is more uncertain than ever. The complexity of the challenges, the diversity of interests, and the evolving international context make it difficult to make any definitive predictions about the transatlantic relationship and the development of the European defense apparatus between strategic autonomy and collective defense. So, we could consider the future around three possible scenarios. In scenario number one, which is the most plausible in the short term, NATO would remain the central pillar of European defense, while Europe, even as it improves its defense capabilities, would remain dependent on the United States from a strategic standpoint and for the supply of weapons. A second scenario would be that of limited strategic autonomy, where Europe would gain capacity in the long term while still remaining within the American sphere. The majority of European powers are not attracted by the French proposal, and the United States relies on Europe for their export of weapons and energy. And finally, a third scenario would be a complete transatlantic break. Europe would be forced to reinvent itself in the face of uncertainty, which could lead to complete strategic autonomy or a total reconfiguration of the European security order. This is the least likely scenario given American and European objectives, but it still needs to be highlighted. Europe is at a crossroads, torn between a changing world and wavering certainties. Dependence on the United States through NATO is showing its limits in the face of changing American priorities. Despite ambitions for strategic autonomy, Europe remains fragmented, hampered by divergent national interests and economic and political constraints. The Rearm Europe plan illustrates this tension, a desire for strengthening that is held back by budgetary, social, strategic, and institutional obstacles. Capacity, industrial, technological, and demographic gaps also raise questions about Europe's ability to defend its interests without American support. Europe will have to choose: remain a partner of the United States, even if it means giving in on areas like energy or armaments, or assume full sovereignty, even if it means challenging the old continental order. For now, without a clear and shared strategy, the talk about rearmament remains pointless in the face of geopolitical challenges. Is Europe ready to overcome its divisions and dependencies to become an autonomous player, or will it remain trapped in a precarious balance dictated by outside powers? In any case, the time for choices has come, and indecision is not an option. In this video, I tried to give you a broad overview of the different ideas, since that's where we currently stand regarding European defense and its geostrategic relationship with NATO and its members. This question is also highly political between federalism and sovereigntism. As you have also seen, France does not have the same vision as, for example, Germany or Italy, no matter what politicians say, not to mention the Anglo-Saxon interests at play. Now we are also on YouTube to share and listen, so tell us what you think about this idea of a European defense. Is this a credible project or just an illusion? What about NATO's role in all of this, the resources and capabilities? Our audience is mostly French, but not exclusively, and it would be interesting to hear your opinions on the subject, since it's about our defense with our money. Thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. By using the link in the description, you get 4 months free on the 2-year subscription, which comes out to about €3 per month, and it's satisfaction guaranteed or your money back for the first 30 days. Let me remind you of the simple actions that make a difference, like click the bell so you don't miss any of our content, and share with as many people as possible. Thank you to the YouTube members who support the channel directly and financially. Thank you all for your loyalty. This is Quentin for Terra Bellum. See you next time.